Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong and happy to be with you again today. We're getting close to the end of the season, right? I mean, it's wrapping up here soon, and the losses continue to pile up, and Utah continues to find ways to do their best to be able to stay competitive, but it just hasn't been able to work out. And so Utah is now on a 6-game losing streak, and you've got 2 games left in the season for a chance to become bowl eligible. I know that's, for some people a bowl really isn't something worth fighting for based on this season, but at the same time, this is still something that means something to them. If anything, just to be able to say that, you didn't fall under 500. It means something to Kyle Whittingham. That's especially if this is his last year, and, we can maybe talk about some of that in a little bit, but if this is his last year, you want to be able to go out on a somewhat of a high in terms of saying that you were able to get to another bowl game and all that kind of stuff. So we'll chat about all these kinds of things. But first, let me tell you about our partners, Black Desert. At Black Desert Resort, you can truly indulge in luxury your way. Whether you choose a sleek studio or an expensive 4-bedroom suite, you're just moments away from teeing off on a championship golf course. Savoring top-tier dining, relaxing poolside, or exploring the rugged beauty of southern Utah. Whatever thrill you seek, it's right outside your door. Your journey awaits at blackdesertresort.com. Get lost and find luxury. All right. So, as I mentioned, Saturday, Utah, traveled on the road to Boulder, Colorado, where they ended up losing 49-24. The final score, I would say, is truly not indicative of how the game was kind of played. But at the same time, it is. This was a Colorado team that really just kind of had its way with Utah. There really wasn't a lot of, I don't want to say there wasn't a lot of hope, because Utah was close in this game near the end. It's an 11-point, I believe it's 11-point, maybe 12-point game down the stretch, and then, a bunch of turnovers and some other things changed that. But for the most part, this is a game where Utah's defense absolutely showed up. They were wreaking havoc. The very first play of the game, Shadir Sanders throws an interception, and Utah's off and running. And so you're thinking, maybe this is exactly what Utah needs to be able to turn the tide, erase the losing streak that they've been on and get going. And unfortunately, it didn't really pan out. Utah just goes with a quick field goal after a 3-and-out that never really materialized. Utah tried to run it, and the run game never really developed in that first series, and that was pretty indicative of the entire game. The run game just didn't show up. It was probably one of the most disappointing aspects of the game. I know you can point to quarterback play and moving the ball, and we'll talk about that, but for the most part, this is the one spot that Kyle Whittingham continues to talk about, is it's not developing. Yeah, you have Mekhi Bernard, but even in this game, he wasn't able to produce. He ran for 20 yards, 11 carries, averaged 1.8 yards per carry. That's just simply not going to cut it, right? They've talked about this many times, where you've got to be able to produce at least 5 yards per carry on an average basis to be able to get Utah what they want to do. Mike Mitchell did get some run in that game. He finished with the team high of 28 yards. Team high being 28 yards is not great. For 7 carries, he averaged 4, so he did a little bit better. But by and large, Utah just wasn't able to get any push. They weren't able to get any separation in terms of the run game, and Utah really struggled to move the offense. And for a Colorado team that plays a lot of man coverage, similar to kind of how Utah does, that becomes a very challenging situation when your quarterback is trying to pick his spots, especially as a true freshman, to find wrinkles in that defense that you can attack, and you've got to have a run game that's complementary to that, and it just simply wasn't. And so that became the biggest challenge for Utah all day. They really struggled to be able to do anything that way, and there was positive momentum at times, but for the most part, it really wasn't because of the run game. And you can say, yes, that Colorado's defense swarmed. I mean, they're a much improved defense, so you don't want to take anything away from what Colorado did, because they are a completely different team than what they looked like last year, a completely different team from even 2 years ago. Obviously, they were now near the bottom, if not the bottom, of college football, the Division I FBS situation. So it was quite the turn of events for them. But despite all that, with the offense, with how the offense wasn't able to churn the ball out, that defense did a phenomenal job. The defense, continued to kind of find their spots, continue to hold them, really until late in the game. It was an issue on special teams where you once again allowed a punt return touchdown. It was, you can't get you can't get touchbacks. I mean, this was a situation where they just couldn't get any luck. And when you're in a game like that, where you have a defense that is really doing everything that it can, you've got to flip the field, right? You've got to be able to make sure that you pin them down in a way that allows that defense to continue to do the things that they need to do. But if you give a team any momentum, any positive field advantage, then it starts to flip, right? Shadir Sanders is a great quarterback, especially at the college level, where he can make you pay. And when he has Travis Hunter and some of these other receivers who absolutely did work well for them, this becomes a big challenge, and you can't be perfect every single down. And for the most part, Utah did, right? Like until late in that game, the defense did well to be able to contain. There were several 3-and-outs. I mean, usually you talk about this, how when the offense doesn't move the ball, that puts a lot of pressure on the defense to be out on the field for a long time. But going into halftime, I mean, that offense has been on the field way more than what the defense was, because they were getting so many quick 3-and-outs. They were holding Colorado well. The only time that Colorado really kind of scored was when you put them in a prime position and you had that special teams touchdown. I mean, Utah did everything that they needed to be able to win that game from a defensive side of the ball. The problem is, in that first half, as I said, the run game didn't develop. It didn't develop all game to that point, but it didn't develop. And then you had an Isaac Wilson who, he really struggled. And there were moments where I think this looked to be one of the ones where he looked the most rushed. He didn't seem comfortable. He wasn't setting his feet very well. There was several times where he even just kind of hucked the ball up there and hoped that it wouldn't get picked off as he was trying to make a play. Part of that was his line was getting blown up a lot, especially in the interior. This has been a common theme. And he was forced to make throws in a timely manner. However, on top of that, there were many times where, as he's going through his progressions, it felt very intentional, where you saw him going through his progressions in a very slow manner, but also he was holding on to the ball too long. So it's kind of like everything all at once. And so for the first half, it became a real tough challenge for this offense to move, because nothing was working. They didn't have anything that they could use. Even, I don't want to say that you could have schemed it better. Maybe you could, right? I think there's things that could have been schemed better. But at the same time, you got somebody that was put in a position that just was not comfortable for them. And part of that reason was, leading up to this game, Isaac Wilson was incredibly sick all week, especially later in the week. There was a real likelihood that he wasn't going to play. On social media, it was trended out there that, he had mono and that he wasn't going to play and that Luke Patari was going to start. And all of those things were kind of true. They were testing him for mono. He did not have it, but he was very sick. His mom later posted a picture that had a caption on it that said he had 102 fever. He was just not feeling at his best. And anybody that's had the flu, especially at a high fever like that, it's tough to be able to compete at a high level, especially in, a game like that where everything is resting on your shoulders, right? When I get in that situation, all I want to do is lay in my bed. But to his credit, he came in there and he wanted to play. It was a game time decision. It was really kind of how he woke up and felt. I think it being early in the morning, maybe it took him a bit to be able to kind of, wear that off and kind of get into a rhythm. Anybody that's been sick, which is everybody, generally knows that in the morning it's tougher. As the day goes on, maybe you kind of perk up a little bit. You have that little afternoon, I'm starting to feel better, and then you kind of sink into the depths of sickness again, and you feel, the despair of life crushing in on you. Not to be too dramatic, but, as much as you don't want to use that as kind of an excuse for Isaac Wilson's play, it's a huge factor, right? I mean, you're going into this with a guy that just honestly hasn't been feeling well all week, and you're putting him up against arguably one of the best defenses in the Big 12 this year. That's not an easy task, and it's not something that you want to go into. But for the most part, he was able to kind of do his best and get to where he needed to. Second half, he does a far better job. I don't know if they did give him IVs, so it's not a matter of that if they did give him IVs to kind of help, but that's literally all that was in his system. He was running on fumes in a lot of ways, and yet in the second half, he actually did improve. I thought the second half performance, there was a much bigger performance level from him where you started to see kind of the things that we've seen from Isaac Wilson all year, where you're like, the positive things, where you look at that and you say, okay, with some momentum and with some people around him that can help him, you were starting to see the tight ends more into that game. You were starting to get a little bit more of a dynamic play calling where they were willing to take a little bit more shots and try to help him. It opened it up a lot where he was able to kind of pick the team apart and do what he needed to. He ended up scoring 2 touchdowns there. His favorite target, Caleb Lohner, obviously gets a touchdown. And Dorian Singer, he finally gets his first touchdown of the season, game 10. And, he's been a great asset for Utah this year. And they finally get him the ball in the end zone and all is good. And Utah's looking like they maybe be able to make this a game. It was just an all around different performance from Isaac in that second half. Things were still not going well for him by and large, but he looked much more comfortable. He looked like he understood what he wanted to do. He looked like he had much more control and command of the offense. I don't know if that was necessarily a scheming of the plays. It obviously looked like there was better attention paid to that, knowing that the run game wasn't getting there. So I think Bajakian in the halftime, kind of changed up some schemes, changed up some looks to be able to say, okay, well, if we can't get the ball to our, running backs, since they can't get, able to do it, we're going to try to find a way to get this passing game open, and it worked. I mean, I think the frustrating thing there is that, that could have been there in that first half too, especially in that first drive. I know, the first drive is generally a scripted drive where you're going to do what you want and try to make it, work the way that you want to. However, in that scenario, you got the ball quicker than you expected to, and you were in a situation where you're almost in the red zone immediately. I think they were actually 21-yard line, I think is where it was. So you're just outside the red zone. But by and large, there were things that they could have done to be able to help Isaac. Some of that is he's got to settle in, right? We've talked about this all season. This is just the nature of being a true freshman. Obviously, there's things that he has to do to be able to avoid interceptions and different things that way. But that's just also the nature of it. When he did start taking more shots, there were things that did open him up to turnovers. There was one that was, particularly bad on the sideline near the end of the game where Utah was had momentum. They made some stops. If they had scored there, I believe it would have been a 4-point game, maybe 3-point, depending on how you approach that. And suddenly now you've got some momentum, and Isaac Wilson threw a costly turnover that didn't help, right? And so there's things like that where he has to cut down on that. You can't be too anxious. Not anxious is not the right word that I want to use, but too ready to kind of shoot your shot and not realize that there's other spots that you can throw the ball to, or whether that be, throwing the ball away, whatever that may be, there's opportunities there for you, right? And, that's just something that he's going to learn. At the end of the day, all of these reps are going to be very valuable for him next year. His final stat line is he was 21 of 40, so he was at 53%, which is, not great compared to what you want him to be. You need him at least in the 60 range. If not 65 would be more ideal. But he had 236 yards. You know, he moved the ball, so it's not a matter of him not being able to move the ball. He had 2 touchdowns. The biggest issues were 3 interceptions and a fumble. You know, and especially late, those proved especially costly. That's where the score decided to balloon, where you turned into an 11-point loss to, you know, a 25-point loss. It makes it look completely different. But when you get those, you know, in plus territory, or in Colorado's territory, I should say, no, your territory. I don't know. I'm flipping the field all over the place in my head. Anyways, close to the end zone. That makes it a tall challenge for a defense to kind of contend with, and it just puts your team in a tough spot. So, you know, after the game, Kyle Whittingham said this was the best team that Utah has faced all year. And I don't necessarily disagree with it. I know some people are saying he's taking a shot at BYU. You can take that for what you want. I don't, you know, that's more rivalry smack talk. And, you know, if you believe that that's what he's doing, sure, go for it, feed into that. I honestly just think he's saying it the way that he needs to. Maybe there is a subtle dig at BYU based off of coming back last week. But, you know, I think this was the most complete team that Utah has faced this year. Obviously, they have arguably one of the best quarterbacks. He's going to be a first-round pick. Travis Hunter, you know, I kind of got into a debate with somebody on Twitter about Travis Hunter being in the Heisman conversation. Personally, I think he should be at the top with Ashton Genty, the Boise State running back. This is a guy that is playing both sides of the ball. He may not be the most elite on both of those, but he's also doing it for 130 snaps every single game. He's coming down with plays that are just game-changing. I mean, there was one that he jumped over, 2-3 Utah defenders and just made a play where he was able to get his feet down and put them in prime territory to score a touchdown. Yes, he got burned on the Dorian Singer one where Dorian was able to get a touchdown over him. But that's, it's one play, right? Like, you're not going to be perfect every time. By and large, this is a guy that is doing everything he can to be able to help Colorado be in contention. The difference this year, I will say, is that Colorado has much more playmakers around him, that he's not as big of a focus on the game as he was even a year before. That's not to say that he's not. I mean, Travis Hunter was everywhere on that field. I felt like every time that I looked up, he was either catching a ball, intercepting a ball, or he was defending a ball, right? Like he was everywhere in that game, and you can't really replicate that in a lot of these teams, right? And Deion Sanders has done a good job with him because he's played both ways. He knows what it takes, and so he's been able to help him kind of understand that. So really curious to see what happens with him, but he is a game changer. Obviously one of the best players in college football right now, and you have to respect him. I understand, I respect people that don't think that he should be in that conversation, especially if you love Ashton Genty, or a Dylan Gabriel or some of these. My only retort would be, you get these types of players on a regular basis. You get a running back that goes off all the time. You get a quarterback that almost seemingly wins it every single year. For me, if I had a vote, I would probably lean towards somebody that we don't see that often. That's my bias. That's how I would go. But either way, this was a very solid team for Utah to contend with. It's easy to look at some positives. There's easy to look at a lot of the negatives, the same season things that have gone on, whether that be the offense or what. But I think there are some positives, and I think if Isaac is the future of Utah football and how they want to approach that, these reps are going to mean everything, right? I mean, Isaac has seen, I wouldn't say everything, but he's seen a majority of the things that he can see to be able to scheme for next year. And if you can bring in a new offensive coordinator that kind of fits his skill set, there's true potential there, if he's there. It could be Brandon Rose. It could be somebody else. I can't imagine that they don't go to the transfer portal and try to find somebody. This year is probably easier than the last few years where you can say, hey, look, that job is not set. If you want to come in here, you can compete. But as I mentioned the last little bit, there's this isn't going to be something where it's just given to anybody. You have to come in there and compete, and you've got to be able to do this in a way to win the job. And if there's a graduate transfer or a more veteran QB that feels like this is where they can be, Utah's absolutely going to entertain that, and it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of works and how the transfer portal works. Obviously, you have the transfer portal that'll be coming up here soon on December 9th when it opens. You'll see players from Utah leaving. You'll see players coming in. But then you have that spring one too. So after spring, depending on how things go, I'm curious to see how this all goes. So what we know today, whether it's Brandon Rose or Isaac Wilson or somebody else, that's going to be the big question moving forward. Obviously, there's still 2 games left in the season, and Isaac is going to be largely the focus of that. If he can end this season on a positive note, I think that absolutely gives him a leg up on the competition. But I still think Kyle is going to kind of leave that open-ended for the next year. So we'll see how that goes. So that was the weekend. I don't think there's much more to get into that. We can kind of jump into what took place this week in terms of Kyle Whittingham's presser, and it was an interesting one. I feel like this season, more than any season that I've been a part of, it's been less about the actual game and more about the things off the field, right? Whether it be Cam Rising's health, whether it be Isaac Wilson and kind of how he's progressing, other things that are related to the sport, but it's been a lot of stuff outside of that, right? And today was no different. There's a lot of conversations about the transfer portal and, different changes that way, as well as hiring an offensive coordinator and different stuff to be able to kind of complement what's going on with the season. And the reality is there's not really much more to talk about with the gameplay because it's the same, right? You have a stacked defense that's going to continue to do well, and you have an offense that can continue to not move the ball. There's been glimpses. Obviously, Brandon Rose shows some glimpses. Isaac has shown some glimpses at times. But by and large, it's a season where the offense just can't click. And so there's going to be a wholesale change at the end of the year. There's going to be a large look to that. So it'll be interesting. I'm curious to see how it all develops. And, hopefully we get back to actually talking about the game, talking about kind of schemes and who they're going up against rather than having to have a lot of these off the field type issues that we have to talk about and become more ancillary to the game, right? This year that's become much more of the focus, and it's distracted in large part to that. And that's going to happen on a losing season. It's not easy. You want to be able to point fingers at somebody and get some answers, and those are all worthy, and that's what we've been trying to do and trying to figure out how this isn't functioning. So, yeah. But on Saturday, it will be senior day, so this is the last home game for Utah. So any fans that are wanting to see their team for the last time in person, this will be the last time, 5:30 kick. Kyle Whittingham, said it's about 25 or so people that will be expiring their eligibility. Quite a bit, right? In most years, Utah gets about anywhere from 8 to 15, 15 being kind of one of the larger ones. And some of those guys are also just like walk-ons or guys that haven't played much. This is a year where there is a lot of eligibility expiring, a lot of guys that are going to be moving on, guys that, might declare early for the NFL draft. There's a lot of that this year. And so you're going to see a much higher turnover of guys wanting to be recognized. And then that has nothing to do with the players that are probably going to enter the transfer portal. So, let's jump into that. Coming into this next year, there's going to be some changes, or at least there's expected to be some changes with roster management stuff. So let me first kind of jump into this with some audio from Kyle talking about this, talking about kind of what the expectation is. And I'll kind of give some background on it and kind of explain all this. But we'll go through some of these things and kind of show what this offseason is going to look like, because that's kind of where the focus is turning a little bit. Obviously, they're trying to get to a bowl game. It's not like they're turning. Kyle specifically mentioned that this is a team with resolve. They're continually fighting. They're going to do whatever they can to get a bowl. And it's he's not just saying that. He had no reason to really talk about that. It's more he really truly wants to get there. This is their goal. And talk about quite an amended goal, right? Going from winning the Big 12, getting into the playoffs, to not even, maybe getting a bowl game. It's crazy, but that's the nature of college football. And when you look back in retrospect, it's easy to kind of see how Utah got here to some extent. And so kind of, interesting development, but that's how it goes. So here's Witt's conversation. We'll start with kind of how they're going to approach some changes to what is, in a settlement hearing, and I'll explain that in a second.
Yeah. Kyle, programs across the country are starting to prepare for the revenue sharing future and divvying up money toward players. Mm-hmm. How, I guess, are you using that approach heading into the next recruiting cycle with transfers and freshmen and high school recruits?
Well, we're using it just like we have been in the past, except it's going to be a bigger bump for us. Some schools it's a huge cut, but for us it's a big bump. And we've already got all the numbers budgeted, spreadsheets galore as far as what we're allocating to each position. How much O, how much D. I mean, it's all mapped out now. It's just a case of going shopping in the portal and filling those needs within those financial parameters.
Yeah, to kind of follow up on that, a lot of programs are finding ways to use third-party entities, whether it be a collective, to kind of circumvent more money.
Oh, yeah. They'll circumvent, trust me. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of circumventing going on.
Yeah. Is that something that you imagine Utah might?
Boy, I hope so. To stay in the game, we're going to have to. To stay in the game at all, we're going to have to, because Oregon seems to be the gold standard for all this stuff, and I guess I shouldn't speak too much about it because I don't know for 100%, but that they're upwards of $30 million overall, and I don't think that's going to drop off with the revenue sharing because they've got very deep pockets there, as do about 15 or 20 other blue bloods in the country. And so, if you want to try to keep pace, you're going to have to supplement the revenue sharing. Have to, if you want to keep pace. If you want to be average, then be average.
If you want to be average, go be average. What a quote, right? There's a lot to unpack there. So let me kind of break this down a little bit. So what's happening is there's currently a court case that reached us close to a settlement. It hasn't fully settled out of court yet, but there's a lot of conversations that probably aren't going to change related to this. So I think this is how athletic departments are kind of operating. They're expecting this. They're preparing for it. If it doesn't happen this year, then they're already ready for it moving forward. But I don't imagine there to be a ton of change to what the settlement is. And so what this brings is it's essentially maybe it's a stopgap in terms of considering college athletes' employees. This is a way to be able to compensate them, to make sure that they are an equal part of what is the revenue that's coming in for these athletic departments, right? And so instead of going all the way through court and, the NCAA losing again in another court battle that they just continually happen, the league has, by and large, come up with a settlement plan that would allow teams to pay about $21.5 million from their own funds. So these are athletic funds. These aren't, anything else. This is athletic funds that would go towards student athletes. Now, the caveat here is this is not just divided up for football, right? So it's not like $21.5 million is going right to football. However, you'd be crazy not to think that this is not going to a majority, like the majority of the money isn't going up to the football program, right? Whatever that breakdown is, I'm curious to see what it is, but rough estimate, I would have to assume that most programs, especially ones that are trying to compete at a high level for football, maybe 75% of that money is going to go towards football. I could be totally wrong, and I'm curious to hear from Utah once this all kind of shakes out. They've been hesitant to say what that is until there's an actual settlement. So I understand that you don't want to kind of put yourself in a corner and you're kind of stuck. So that's kind of the baseline number that you can do. That doesn't mean that a school has to do that. They have to pay players, but there is a minimum that you have to pay, and it's wonky. I'm not going to get into all of the details. Just suffice it to say that schools will have to be paying players to be able to be a part of the program, right? And so this goes through, whether it be football, basketball, women's basketball, gymnastics, volleyball, track and field, all of these are going to be impacted in that. And as part of that will impact maybe what some of these sports are going to be, right? Because the more you want to invest in, let's say, football or basketball, the two programs that at most schools are generally going to be the plus margin revenue, that's where you're probably going to put most of your effort, because there's generally such a bigger bang for your buck in that situation where you can put money into it and see a real return. All these other sports, it becomes much more of a challenge. They consider them the Olympic sports or whatever you want to call them. Those become a challenge. That's not to say that other schools don't have that, right? There's phenomenal schools around the country where hockey is absolutely leading that out. Those types of schools, if they want to invest in that, that's where it's going to be. And so what Utah has to do is there's going to be a baseline of how much money that they have to pay. And as you heard Kyle say, that's going to be a big influx to what they've been paying, right? Right now, you're paying players out of NIL funds, collective funds, that kind of stuff, that in theory, it's been kind of outside of the university's control, although the collectives have been brought in-house, or they can be brought in-house. And so there's been these changes where money has just been kind of fluid to some extent in how it's operated. This one will absolutely be set up with the athletic department, right? And so within that, whatever allocation that the football team gets, they will then allocate that more down into various position groups, right? Your quarterbacks, your offensive line, defensive line, those are generally going to be one of your higher ones. You're going to have some that are, wide receivers. They've broken it down, or at least how they feel like they've broken it down to be able to allocate that money on the players that they feel is the most valuable to the team, right? Like I said, getting a quarterback is probably going to be the most valuable, and if this year has taught you anything, quarterback is going to be that, where you're going to probably pay a large sum of this profit sharing to these players, right? And that's just the baseline. Now, granted, this money by and large isn't going to be massive, right? You've got to think at some of these schools, 400 athletes, 600 athletes, whatever the case may be. If you divide that $21.5 million up, it's not like all of these guys are getting checks for $1 million, right? This is going to be much lower sums, but it's still it's a good starting wage, right? It's a good consistent wage where these schools know that they can compete. And if you're, a school like Utah is going to try, and I haven't once again gotten into the details here because they're still trying to figure it out. A school like Utah is going to do their best to be able to give the max allocation that they possibly can, right? They want to be able to compete with the Oregons. As you heard Kyle said, that Oregon is kind of the gold standard. They have Phil Knight, and that's different. I'll get into that one. But they're going to put up the max amount that they can put in, right? And they're going to try to do whatever they can to compete, because this is an arms race. And the more money you throw at something, the more money some other team is going to throw at it. And so you've got to kind of stay in competition with that. Utah's never been the program that's going to compete with the Ohio States, the Georgias, the Alabamas, the Oregons with those deep pockets, right? But at the same time, if they can do what they can to allocate some of these athletic funds to the players to at least make it somewhat even, or at least close to that, that gives you a much better starting point for some of these players that may be considering you, especially some of these high-level players, the 4 or 5-star guys. They can consider Florida, they can consider Georgia, or whatever it may be, but you can still consider Utah because Utah is on par with that. This will be an interesting develop to see how that goes, but Utah is going to do their best to get there. Now, this settlement, they have their final hearing, or at least it's expected to be the final hearing on April 7th of next year. So we've still got some time, but you're starting to build the roster, right? And you're starting to get there. As part of that, if this settlement stays the same, they're going to limit how many people you can have on a roster. That limit right now is set at 105, and it's supposed to be intended to be all scholarships. Now, you can kind of divvy that up to an extent on how you give them a full scholarship or not. It's going away with you have to do a 1-to-1. You can give partial scholarships. You can do different things that way. So curious to see kind of how that develops and kind of how roster management is built. Essentially, you're taking away walk-ons in the true concept of what you've got now. It's more teams just kind of stockpiling talent, but at the same time, they're losing some talent too, because most teams have about 120, 130 players on their team with walk-ons and everything that way. So there will be some changes if Utah is planning towards that in this offseason. And so you're going to kind of see them, whether that be through recruiting class or the transfer portal, they're going to be loading up heavily to be able to make sure that they get there. And so in years past where, they have a certain number where they say we're only going to take 10 people from the transfer portal, that number is probably going to explode over the next little bit because you've got, a lot more things that you have to do. So that's the settlement side of things, right? But on top of that, as part of the settlement and as part of just college football and the nature that we're in now, NIL deals will still be on top of this, right? It's still not a pay-for-play. At least that's what they're going to say. Right now, it's kind of been this jumbled mess of you're coming to this school, we'll pay you X amount of dollars to play. That's 100% against what the NCAA wants, right? They've never wanted to have a pay-for-play system because it becomes chaotic, and you get it what it is today. And I think that's where most people are frustrated with the transfer portal and NIL. At the end of the day, though, it's you're seeing it this year where it's, arguably brought in more parity to the game, where you're getting teams that can, flex their funds or do whatever they need to be able to improve. It can also be very dangerous because you could have some teams that absolutely throw cash and there's nothing you can do to compete. But at the end of the day, you still have to have good systems. It doesn't matter how much you spend. If Oregon had a terrible coaching staff and they didn't have a great culture or anything like that, it doesn't matter how much Phil Knight is throwing at you if you can't get it done, right? And so we've seen that. There's been a lot of programs out there that have thrown a ton of money at people and they're still not competing at the level that they expect. And so that's the nature of it. But with this, NIL deals will still be a part of this. And so you'll still get guys getting paid through NIL, but it's supposed to go through an independent review, and it's supposed to be aligned with what is truly more the NIL thing, where you're getting paid for your name, image, and likeness. That's being able to show in on commercials or being the figure for a car dealership in the state, right? Those types of things where they're getting money for using their appearance and doing things that way. They're not just getting money to come play for a program. And so in theory, that's the way it's supposed to work. Whether that actually does or not is going to be the real question. There's still going to be teams that are trying to exploit that. There's still going to be things done to be able to make sure that they can try to get more money, right? So there's going to be this baseline through the settlement where the athletic department are paying players, and then on top of that, you will still have NIL deals. Now, that may or may not change on how we know it today, but that's the intent. So Utah's scheming up for that right now. They're doing their best as the season's drawing to a close, and this would happen whether they're winning or losing. In some ways, it helps them now because they have a clearer picture of how they have to go, and somehow, in some ways, you have to kind of clear house and kind of restart. But that's not to say that Utah doesn't have players on this roster that are worth keeping, right? And so there's this combo of where you have to re-recruit your players, make sure that they're invested in your program, and that you can keep them, whether that's through NIL funds or other things. You've got to be able to re-recruit your team and see where they stand. And some of that is the coaching staff won't get in the way of a player. Well, they can't get out in the way of a player transferring anyway. But what I mean by that is they will put up more of a fight for some players than others. And that's just the nature of it, right? In this age where this becomes much more of a free agency, it becomes an opportunity for coaches and players to be able to kind of do what they need to be able to get the best situation. And I know some people complain about the transfer portal, but at the same time, if you were stuck in a job that you were miserable with and there was no way out, like, it would be miserable, right? Like, you should have a free reign to be able to seek another job. That's the exact same as this. Players, if they don't feel comfortable, and you can say they're prima donnas and, they're doing whatever, yada, 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 This is them trying to seek the best opportunity. And the ones that are successful and the ones that actually buy into the systems and aren't just kind of portal hopping and doing that are generally going to be the best. Consistency still matters in this sport, but at the same time, that's not to say that you can't find success jumping around, right? Like, I have friends that are in business and they've jumped around to different jobs, and each job they generally get paid more, right? Because they're attractive, they want to be able to get into a better situation, and it works for them. And there's others that have been incredibly loyal to their their business, and they stay. And their earnings probably aren't as high as the others, but maybe they have a better work environment. I don't know. Each person kind of has to decide that for themselves, and that's the same in college football. That's the same with some of these others, where the coaching staff can say, look, you can stay on the team, but you're not going to get the playing time, and it's going to be a real challenge for you. There's players that'll still stick around and they still want to, kind of be in that system and learn, but it's going to give much more freedom to be able to help them kind of move along. All of this has kind of happened already in the past. It's just at an accelerated rate, and there's a ton more people. So, there's not a lot that changes there. But it is interesting kind of how they're going to divvy this up, how they're going to look at the transfer portal. And the biggest factors of that is really how Utah now schemes. The biggest thing there is, when you come in, for example, coming into this year, you had Morgan Scally and Andy Ludwig. And yes, the defense has a very difficult scheme, and it's a challenge, but it's not one that you can't plug and play a guy, right? You can bring in a guy like a Cam Calhoun, who was on Michigan's roster last year, comes in as a redshirt freshman. He's getting meaningful minutes in this game, and that's not because he can't, learn the system, right? It's a complicated system, and Morgan Scally is very, he's got a brilliant mind on how the name just blanked me, but he does different things to be able to help the defense really confuse the offense. And so you've got to be able to be involved with that and be able to get involved in a way that is more than just a surface level defense, right? This is a very NFL style type defense, and you've got to be able to learn it to be able to be in there. And the ones that come in and learn it the best and perform the best are going to play. But it's been a much easier path for guys to get into the defensive side of the ball on their first year than it is on the offense. And part of that is because when Andy Ludwig was here, his offense was very challenging. You had him, trying to come up with this complicated offense that once you've been in the system, the old way of doing things and the way that Utah has really kind of had success is you come in there, you bring these guys through the high school ranks, you develop these under-recruited players, and they've been in the system for 2 or 3 years, and they've matured and marinated in it, and they understand it inside and out. And so by the time that they're, maybe a sophomore, definitely as a junior and senior, they should have a good expectation of what this offense is, and then they run with it, right? There's some that excel on a higher rate, and they can pick it up faster. But by and large, this is a very difficult offense to be able to master. And so in the transfer portal era, when you're bringing in these guys that are either 1 year or maybe 2 max, you can't afford for them to be able to come in and do it in 2 years, because then they're never going to play. I've talked about this many times this season. This isn't anything new, but Kyle Whittingham talked about these things today. And partly this comes down to, first off, they have to hire a new offensive coordinator, right? And those conversations are happening. So let's jump with that, because this all kind of factors into this, and we can explain this on how it goes. So starting with the hiring of an offensive coordinator.
Telling us to hire an offensive coordinator this offseason. With the regular season ending in 2 weeks, at what point do you start putting together a list of potential candidates, or is that something you've already done?
That's going on right now, evaluating, what we're doing, what's attractive candidates outside the program. I'm evaluating everything right now and getting the short list ready. But yeah, that'll be job one. As soon as the timing is right to get that filled, and recruits want to know who the coordinator is going to be, and that's something that we will need to have solved sooner rather than later.
So you've essentially got this 21-day period before the transfer portal opens, where you kind of have to figure out this offensive coordinator if you can, right? That's not to say that Utah will have that offensive coordinator hired by then or have an idea of who it is. You would hope that they would have somebody identified by then where they can pursue, whether they're already on a roster that's playing, whatever that may be. It becomes a challenge. But they need over these next 21 days to absolutely make it worth it, because they're going into the transfer portal time as well as the early signing period. And so you've got to have these recruits that they've got to remain committed. And especially once the season ends, and that could be in 2 weeks, or it could be later if Utah, ends up winning these last 2 games to get to a bowl. I think that's a tall task for them, but it's still on the table. But this becomes a very difficult few weeks where you think where you're essentially trying to find a new person to do that. All of that's over. All of that also has Kyle Whittingham's future in mind, right? Kyle has intimated that he's not going to be here that long, obviously. I mean, he's been here 20 years. They've given Morgan Scalley the coach in waiting tag because they want to make him the next guy. Everything has lined up to be, this is potentially his last year. And the general thinking was that Cam Rising was coming back. They would go right out in the sunset together, essentially, where you go to the Big 12 championship, you make it into the playoffs. That's where they put all their eggs. They honestly, truly believed that. They had the roster to do it, and that was going to be it. Obviously, things have changed. Week 2, everything changed for this team, and it hasn't gone as planned. Now, there's a lot of people saying, well, would Kyle ever leave on a losing season? I'm starting to think that doesn't matter as much. And I've talked to some few people that have had, inside knowledge on this, and those conversations, I would say, I don't want to say they're accelerating because that makes it sound like, as we're getting closer, the season is coming upon us and he's having more conversations about it. But I think the point there is there have been more conversations that Kyle has had about his future, and meaning, future outside of football. And so I wouldn't at all be surprised if he hangs it up after this season. I think it's trending towards that. I'll say that. But at the end of the day, it's really up to how he feels. They haven't been shy about that. Mark Harlan, the athletic director, has said that it's up to Kyle. Kyle has said, whenever he feels like it, he calls himself day-to-day, which, it's ironic that he said that on Big 12 Media Days, that he's day-to-day and how he approaches it, because I feel like that's been this whole season on quarterbacks and everything else, day-to-day, game-time decisions. He should have just said he's a game-time decision. Whether he shows up to coach that day will depend. Man, that would be, I feel like he's got to do that now on the last game just to kind of round things out, so... that would be rough. Could you imagine, Kyle is a game time decision coming into that UCF game. Morgan Scalley is projected to start. I don't know. Anyways, but this is kind of on top of those conversations of hiring a new offensive coordinator or what this is going to be. So, the future of Utah football is in those next 21 days, honestly, whether that be with Kyle Whittingham or the offensive coordinator. Firstly, most importantly, it is the offensive coordinator right now. If Kyle decides to walk away, then it does turn and it shifts to Morgan Scalley, who has the head coach in waiting tag. So we'll see how that goes. But as part of that conversation that Kyle has said about the offensive coordinator, he said today that Morgan Scalley is very involved in those conversations and that he's going to be a big factor in kind of how Utah views this new offensive coordinator. He says it would be an injustice if it wasn't, if he wasn't involved in that. He said he's been working side by side with him. So, you have to imagine that regardless of if Whittingham stays this year, hangs it up next year, whatever it may be, Morgan Scalley is largely dictating the future of his roster or his coaching roster right now. Obviously, he's the defensive coordinator, so he's got to have somebody in mind there, and he does. He's got different things there floating around, and I know that he wants to be able to have an offense that is different from what Utah operates right now. I wouldn't say it wouldn't be less conservative. It's not as conservative as how Kyle runs it, right? Kyle wants to be able to control the ball. He wants to make sure to limit turnovers. Morgan absolutely wants to be able to come up with an offense that is different and is much more, I would say, modern and kind of fits to how the players are playing now. So there will be changes, right? This isn't going to be a Kyle Whittingham clone 2.0 type thing. They are different people. Obviously, they're going to operate in the same type of culture experience where you're trying to, get guys to buy in and you're part of the family. And if you do what you can to do your 1/11th, as they like to say. But this is a different coach, right? He's not going to run it the exact same way as Kyle Whittingham. So curious to see how that goes. But that offensive coordinator position has to be the number one job outside of the head coach. And so that'll be interesting to see how they go. I'll be interested to see if they can get a hire or at least have a name or some names floated out there to kind of help recruits understand that, to help the players in the transfer portal or in the program know who they are. I mean, the reality is Isaac Wilson came to Utah for Andy Ludwig, and whether they expected him to stay there long term or not, that's not the question. But you have to instill confidence in the players that you have there that you want. And maybe they're fine with Brandon Rose or Isaac Wilson walking. I don't know. I don't know what those conversations are like. But if you want to keep those guys around, they have to have some buy-in with the offensive coordinator. And that's not to say that Whittingham or Scally are going to go to, either one of those players or any other players and say, who do you want as your offensive coordinator? But there's some of those things that you have to factor in, right? At the end of the day, they have to find who they like, because players are going to come and go, and you've got to be able to run a system that you feel like is productive and effective. So on that subject, talking about kind of the changes to the program, Kyle touched on that as well. So I want to get into that because this goes to kind of the point that I was talking about earlier.
So along those lines, the strength of Utah football program for a long time has been able to identify guys maybe other programs didn't, and then develop them.
Right.
But with people coming and going so quickly, how do you develop them, and does that take away an advantage that you've leaned on for a couple of decades?
Yeah, no excuses, but that was our formula. Recruit, develop, and manage, and with the turnover and with the way the portal is now, that system is, I don't want to say it's a dinosaur, but it is very hard to continue to have work. And so, and that also plays into, you got to take a hard look at your schemes, because your schemes better be plug and play now. You can't have a scheme that's so complicated and so in depth that it takes a guy 2 or 3 years to learn it, because you don't have that time anymore. And so that's another conversation we're having, another facet of what we're doing that needs to be streamlined, because, like I said, you collect all the talent you can in the offseason and then just hope it gels and has chemistry, and they better be able to assimilate the offense and the defensive schemes in that short period of time in order to function. And so that's something that we're looking at hard and making sure we get corrected.
The head man said it, right? You've got to be able to look at your schemes, and for as much as Kyle Whittingham has really loved his system of being able to keep guys in the program, let them develop in there, kind of show your way through the program, mature and get through that. He can do that all he wants, but he's going to become the exception rather than the rule, right? You've got to be able to have an offense and a defense that is much more transfer portal friendly. You've got to be able to have these guys in here. Like I look at a guy like a Damian Alford, for example, transfers in from Syracuse, expected to be this guy that was, a big factor in the offense, and we've seen him once. And essentially his one appearance was he threw an interception in a game, and it obviously didn't work out too well. That's not to say that he's not capable, right? He was a starter at Syracuse. He knows what to do, and obviously he has to assimilate to Utah's offense. But because it was so complicated and it was so hard on how it was approached, and that's not to say that a different offense couldn't be a challenge either based on what Syracuse was doing, but you've got to be able to have an offense that is going to be much more user-friendly or player-friendly for the transfer portal era. You can't expect them to be in there for 1 or 2 years. You've got to expect them to say, we can come in, and, you hope that they come in with spring, because that's generally going to be a better system for them. But you have to hope that even if they come in fall, that they're at least going to be able to get up to speed, midway through the season and be a contributing player. Spring is still going to be a very vital part for these players, right? You've got to be able to go through the transfer portal in this early season and get into spring and kind of work through the team. I don't think that's going to change, but I think you've got to be able to have an offense especially, and we've seen that a ton this year. You've got to have an offense especially that is able to be able to do that. If you can't plug and play these players, it's not going to work. You're seeing it at, let's say, Oregon, right? And granted, they're loading up on talent upon talent. So, I mean, I get it. But, you come in there and they have a quarterback who, largely, a couple of years ago, Bo Nix, he was largely thrown away in the college football world, right? A lot of people didn't like what he did at Auburn. He wasn't a great quarterback. He was living through the pressure of it being, his family's school. He comes to Oregon, and suddenly all of that starts to change. You didn't get the negative Bo Nix conversation, and now he's an NFL quarterback as a starter as the Denver Broncos, and he's doing a phenomenal job. Part of that is being able to have an offense that can develop these players and give them what they need in the way that they need to, right? While also still not changing your system. You've got to be able to have your thing, but it's been much easier for them to be able to scheme around these players because they can get into it and do what they need to. There doesn't have to be these complicated things, right? At the end of the day, football, yes, it can be very complicated, and there's a lot to it that is complicated, but you still have the very basic schemes that you can utilize, and as long as you do it well and you function properly, a lot of that stuff goes out the window, right? Most of these offenses out there aren't these complicated things where you've got to, pay attention to this, and they're going to have their different wrinkles. But like part of the success that a Mike Leach had, he chucked that ball around all the time. You knew exactly what he was going to do, and he still found a way to do it. He just got the athletes to be able to excel at it. That's where Utah needs to hone in on now, right? They've got to be able to find that, and that's the hardest challenge, right? Is finding the athletes that can do the offense that you want. But if you can find a right offensive coordinator to do it, you're going to be fine. There's a reason why Kenny Dillingham has done so well at Arizona State. You can't tell me that Arizona State suddenly has the best, the best recruits in the country, or that they're better than Utah. No. Like, their recruiting classes for the last few years have really struggled, even with the transfer portal. Yes, they have improved, but it's not like suddenly that this roster is so much better than Utah's that Utah can't be a part of this, right? You just have to be able to have a system that works for these players that gets the most out of that. And that's it's not easy, right? It's not easy for me to sit here and say on a Monday in November that Utah needs to hire this offensive coordinator that's going to be dynamic. Well, duh. That's just like saying you need to go get a 5-star running back and you're going to be better. Like, it makes sense. But I think, this is a change in all of what Utah has done for so long, is they've tried so hard to get these players to mature through the system that it just doesn't work out. In the current structure, it did work out forever because Kyle was able to take 2-3-star guys and turn them into these beasts where they got through their system and they became much better players than what their initial high school ratings said. Now you're having to do that at a much more accelerated rate, and you're having to do it with a different style. That partially leads to why Kyle Whittingham also is probably leaning towards more leaving as well. It's not that he can't change, and he's done a great job of changing the last few years, especially in the NIL era and trying to get everything to adapt to that. But it becomes much more of a challenge to be able to do something completely counter to what you've done. And this isn't some crazy thing, but on top of that is, as part of this offense, is you've got to let that control go. Kyle Whittingham very much so. He likes his, he very much so, if he trusts you, he's going to let you have it. And Utah for the last few years was very effective there because he trusted Andy Ludwig, he trusted Cam Rising, and everything else fell into place. And that's why they had so much success. Outside of that, I don't want to say he doesn't have trust, but it's cautious, right? Like, he's much more conservative with it, where he wants to see how it goes. You hire an offensive coordinator and it may not come in and be what you want it to be. That's why coaches change all the time. And so he's not going to give him the full reins either, just like you wouldn't give a young quarterback the reins completely. You've got to build that trust. You've got to be able to see it. Andy Ludwig had been in the system forever, and he had been trusted forever with Kyle, that it was easy for them to have that. And then Cam kind of fit into the system in a perfect way where you could trust him. And suddenly that offense became dynamic, and it was much easier to kind of utilize. And all of a sudden, all these things that Kyle had never done before, like taking the ball at the coin toss, or trying to do these things that really effectively got the offense on the field instead of the defense, it changed because you trusted Andy Ludwig and you trusted Cam Rising. That's the hard part, right? So he can hire a new offensive coordinator and it can be a plug-and-play system, but he also has to change in his mindset as well. In my opinion, you've got the defense to do it. Like, take more risks, right? And that's easy for me to say, but at the same time, this is where Utah needs to figure it out. And this offseason is going to be a big change in that. We're going to find out who their new offensive coordinator is going to be. We're going to find out if there's a new head coach and if Morgan Scalley takes over, all that kind of stuff. All that's going to be answered in the next few weeks. There's still games to be played. Utah obviously is playing Iowa State this week, and there's opportunities here for Utah to win. They are an underdog. I need to look and see when the last time Utah was an underdog at home. Maybe it's that Oregon game last year, the game day game. I can't remember. But it doesn't happen that often, right? And Iowa State, I don't want to say that they're not a good team because they are, but they're not one of those teams like an Oregon was last year, right? Where suddenly they should be favored and, you're not expecting a USC coming into town. This is a good team, but it's not the biggest team that Utah's faced, and now they're an underdog because of how they've played this year. So we'll get into that this week. We'll kind of keep breaking down these things. I do appreciate you guys tuning in on this. I know it's not easy this season. We'll get some basketball in this as well as we keep going. Utah men's basketball lost last night, but there's a lot more optimisms to come from that, and we can get into that kind of stuff as well. So I appreciate you getting into this with me, and we'll continue to chat, and we'll recap or preview, on Thursday and continue to see how the season develops. So thanks for listening. Have a great day.